We drove her ourselves in the rusted pickup our father had left behind before he vanished into the desert. At the border, the guards took one look at the woman and waved us through. I didn't understand why until much later. 2 weeks after that night, we were summoned to a sprawling white hacienda in the hills above the city. The woman we had saved was Doña Valeria Aguilar, the matriarch of the Aguilar organization, the cartel that controlled every shipping route, every customs officer, every politician who mattered in 3 states. She was dressed in black silk with a silver rosary around her neck, and her eyes were the color of cold coffee. Beside her stood a young man who didn't look at us. He was tall and angular with dark curls falling across his forehead, and he was staring at a tablet that displayed a star chart. He didn't acknowledge our presence at all. Doña Valeria spoke without preamble. One of you will marry my son Mateo. The other will receive $5 million in cash. Choose. My sister Paloma stood perfectly still for about 2 seconds. Then she pointed straight at the briefcase on the mahogany table. I'll take the money. A cold current shot through my veins. In that single moment, I knew. Paloma had been reborn too. Doña Valeria, she said, her voice toning sweet and reasonable. My sister Marisol has always been the romantic one. She dreams of finding a real home, of belonging to something bigger than herself. I already have a boyfriend back in Juarez.
We're engaged. I couldn't possibly walk away from him. She pressed her hand to her chest with a theatrical sincerity I had seen her deploy 1,000 times. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I was too busy remembering how my previous life had ended. In that life, Paloma had been the one who lunged at the chance to marry into the Aguilar dynasty. She had thrown herself at Mateo, abandoned her fiancé Raul without a backward glance, and spent the following 11 months being systematically, psychologically dismantled. Mateo Aguilar had no interest in violence. His cruelty was quieter. He was obsessed with astronomy. He could name every star in the northern hemisphere and calculate orbital decay to the 5th decimal point. But he had no tolerance for people who pretended to be something they weren't. Paloma had told his mother during the interview that she loved astronomy, that she spent her free time reading astrophysics journals, that she dreamed of lying under the desert sky with someone who understood the universe. It was a complete fabrication. She thought it would make her seem cultured and compatible. Instead, it triggered his deepest pathology. He didn't lock her in a torture chamber or break her fingers. He locked her in his private observatory for days at a time with nothing but astronomical textbooks and a notebook. He would visit her every evening and quiz her on elliptical orbits and precession cycles and the Hertzsprung-Russell diagram. When she failed to answer correctly, he didn't touch her. He just sat there in silence for hours, staring at her with those dark, unreadable eyes until she sobbed and apologized. Then he would leave her alone with more books, more tests, more silence. By the 6th month, she couldn't form a coherent sentence about anything except stellar parallax. By the 9th month, she was institutionalized in a private clinic in Monterey. I visited her once. She was sitting in a white room, rocking back and forth, muttering about the distance to Alpha Centauri. When she saw me, her eyes cleared for a moment.
Why are you happy, Marisol? Why do you get to have a life? You were supposed to suffer with me. We're twins. We share everything. You took my chance. You stole it.
In that life, I had taken the $5 million. I had used it to attend university in Mexico City and then started a small ethical manufacturing cooperative that employed hundreds of women who had once worked in maquiladoras like we had. I had been content. Paloma hated me for it so fiercely that on the day she was released from the clinic, she followed me to a mountain overlook and pushed me off a cliff. I fell for what felt like hours before my body hit the rocks below. When I woke up again, I was 17. And the SUV was still smoking on the highway. So now, in Doña Valeria's hacienda, I watched Paloma point at that briefcase, and I understood everything. She knew what Mateo Aguilar was capable of, and she was sacrificing me to him while she escaped with the money. I didn't let her get away with it completely, but I also couldn't walk away because our grandmother was dying. I stepped forward and placed my hand on the briefcase before Paloma could lift it. Doña Valeria, I said, your offer is incredibly generous, But my sister and I were raised to believe that helping someone in danger isn't a transaction. We don't deserve $5 million for doing the right thing. However, my grandmother is very ill. She has untreated diabetes, and she's been working double shifts at a textile plant for 30 years. If you truly want to reward us, help her get medical care. Real care. A private clinic with doctors who can manage her condition. That's all I ask. Doña Valeria studied me for a long moment. Her expression was completely unreadable. Then she glanced at Mateo, who still hadn't looked up from his star chart. "This is the one," she said. "Not a question. A decision." Mateo finally raised his eyes. They were a deep liquid brown, almost black, and they fixed on me with an intensity that made my breath catch. He looked at me for perhaps 10 seconds. Then he nodded once and returned to his tablet. And that is how I became engaged to Mateo Aguilar.
Paloma was furious enough to crack mirrors. She cornered me in our grandmother's tiny kitchen the next morning. "Are you insane, Marisol? Doña Valeria offered us $5 million and you traded it for a few hospital bills? We could have been rich. Instead, you're going to marry a man everyone calls El Fantasma. He never leaves that observatory. He never speaks to anyone. You're going to rot in that hacienda like a bird in a cage." "Then you marry him," I said. Her mouth snapped shut. "I have Raul," she managed after a pause. "I'm engaged. I love him." "You were engaged to Raul in another life too," I thought, "and you left him the moment a better offer appeared." But I said nothing. The crisis with our grandmother came 3 weeks later. She collapsed at the textile plant and was rushed to a public hospital. The doctor said her blood sugar had crashed dangerously low. They asked us what medications she'd been taking. Paloma said she didn't know. She'd been the one helping Abuela with her insulin for the past 2 months. I sat in the hospital corridor with my head in my hands and replayed Paloma's movements over the past weeks. She had been so eager to take over Abuela's care, so insistent that I focus on my extra shifts at the factory. And now Abuela was on a ventilator, and the cost was astronomical. Paloma wept prettily, but she didn't offer to pay anything. On the 4th day, I called the number Doña Valeria had given me. On the 5th day, Abuela was transferred to a private clinic with round-the-clock care and a specialist who had trained at Johns Hopkins. On the 6th day, I signed a marriage contract with Mateo Aguilar. Our wedding took place in the hacienda's private chapel. The only guests were Doña Valeria, a priest who looked like he'd seen too many bodies, and Paloma, who sat in the back row wearing an expression of barely concealed triumph. She had been given an envelope containing the first $500,000. The rest would follow after Abuela was stable. She thought she had won. I didn't see her after the ceremony. She left the hacienda within the hour to meet Raul in Juarez, where they would begin spending money they hadn't earned. I went to the observatory. The building was a dome of white stone on a hill behind the main house. Inside, it was cool and dark and filled with the quiet hum of tracking equipment. Mateo was standing beside the telescope, adjusting something on the control panel. He didn't turn when I entered. "I don't know anything about astronomy," I said. "I'm not going to pretend I do. I brought a book, but I suspect I won't understand half of it. I just want you to know that whatever tests you have planned, I'm not trying to fake my way through them. I'd rather fail honestly than lie well." Mateo stopped adjusting the telescope. He turned around slowly. "You came here expecting punishment," he said. "Why?" "Because my sister told me you were a monster, and because the version of me that existed in another life believed her." He didn't ask what I meant by another life. He just tilted his head slightly, as if I were a particularly interesting variable in a complex equation. "What did she say I would do?" "She said you would lock me in this observatory and quiz me on astronomy until my mind broke. She said you did it to her once, in a timeline that no longer exists." He was silent for a long moment. Then he pulled a leather-bound notebook from a shelf and handed it to me.
"Read this," he said. "It's her work." I opened the notebook. It was filled with astronomical calculations written in Paloma's handwriting. But something was strange about them. The equations were all slightly wrong. The diagrams were sloppy, and scrolled in the margins were notes that became increasingly frantic. "I can't do this. Why does he keep asking? What does he want from me? I'm going to lose my mind." Mateo took the notebook back and returned it to the shelf. "I never locked her in this room," he said quietly.
I gave her a textbook and asked her to study it because she said she loved astronomy. I gave her a notebook to write her observations. I spent weeks trying to have a conversation with her about the things she claimed to care about. But everything she said was wrong. Not just wrong, fabricated. She had memorized a few phrases from Wikipedia and tried to pass them off as knowledge. When I pressed her, she panicked and started crying. Then she accused me of torturing her. He looked at me with those dark, unreadable eyes. I don't torture people, Marisol. I just can't tolerate being lied to. I grew up in a house where every word was a manipulation and every promise was a trap. My father lied to my mother about his mistresses. My mother lied to my father about her loyalties. Their business partners lied to both of them. When I was 12, one of my father's men pretended to be my friend and then tried to kidnap me for ransom. After that, I decided I would rather be alone than surrounded by people who treat falsehood like a language. He gestured at the telescope. Astronomy doesn't lie. Stars don't lie. You can calculate their behavior down to the second and they will never deceive you. I walked over to the telescope and looked through the eyepiece. The moon was a sharp white crescent against the black sky and the craters were perfectly defined. I don't know how to do any of those calculations, I said, but I'd like to learn.
Not because I'm pretending to be something I'm not, because it's the first thing anyone in this house has shared with me that wasn't a transaction. Mateo stood beside me and began adjusting the focus. Then I'll teach you, he said. That was the beginning. Learning the cartel business from Doña Valeria was a different kind of education. She saw something in me, a willingness to work, and a complete lack of sentimentality about the family business. I didn't romanticize the drug trade. I also didn't pretend it wasn't what funded our life. I focused on the legitimate side, the logistics companies, the agricultural holdings, the real estate investments that needed to be cleaned and structured for a future where the cartel would need to evolve or die. You think like a woman who's been poor and refuses to go back, Doña Valeria said one afternoon as we reviewed shipping manifests in her office. That's a good thing. The rich forget how to survive. The poor never do. Meanwhile, Abuela was transferred to a residential care facility in the mountains. Her diabetes was being managed by actual specialists, and for the first time in decades, she was sleeping through the night. I visited her every weekend. I didn't tell her about the cartel. I told her I had married a quiet man who ran an import-export business and that I was learning the trade. She held my hand and said, "Your mother was the wild one, but you were always the anchor. I'm glad you found your harbor." Paloma spent her money exactly the way I expected. She and Raul moved into a gated community in El Paso and bought matching sports cars and hosted parties for people who only stayed as long as the champagne flowed. Raul wasn't just a wastrel. He was a degenerate gambler who owed money to a rival cartel, the Fuentes organization. Paloma paid his debts once, then again, then a third time. Within 18 months, her $5 million was gone, burned through like dry grass, and the Fuentes cartel was still calling. That was when I set my trap. Through the Aguilar organization's network, I established a shell company called Sierra Verde Development Group. It presented itself as a luxury eco-resort developer building sustainable tourism destinations in the Yucatan. The brochures were beautiful. The website was polished. The projected returns were astronomical. I had a former banking executive who now owed us favors act as the pitchman, introducing the opportunity to wealthy investors at exclusive events in Monterey and Cancun. Paloma and Raul weren't wealthy investors, but they knew the pitchman through a friend of a friend, and they begged for an audience. When they met him, he explained that Sierra Verdera was oversubscribed. The minimum investment was $2 million, and all current spots were filled. But perhaps for the sister of Doña Valeria's daughter-in-law, an exception could be made. Raul mortgaged the El Paso house and the sports cars. Paloma borrowed from every loan shark who would take her calls. They scraped together $1.8 million and handed it over with the desperate hope of turning it into 10. The day the Sierra Verdera Group declared bankruptcy, I was sitting in the observatory with Mateo, watching a lunar eclipse. The funds had been routed through 5 holding companies and deposited into a foundation that funded medical care for the families of maquiladora workers. The paperwork was immaculate and untraceable. Paloma and Raul had $42 in their checking account. Mateo handed me a cup of hot chocolate. "Your sister has been calling the gatehouse every hour," he said. "She's demanding to speak with you." "I'll speak to her eventually. Just not yet." 2 weeks after the bankruptcy, the Fuentes cartel sent a message to Raul. "Pay what you owe or we will start collecting in other ways." Raul panicked and disappeared. Paloma was left alone in a rented apartment with no money and no allies. She called me sobbing. "Marisol, please, I know you run the family's finances now. Everyone says you're the real power behind Doña Valeria."
Just lend me $2 million. I'll pay it back, I swear on Abuela's life.
Don't you dare swear on Abuela, I said, my voice cold. Not after what you did to her. There was a long silence on the line. What do you mean? I mean her insulin, Paloma. I know you were withholding it. I know you were skipping her doses so she would collapse and I would be desperate enough to marry Mateo and you would get your money. I've known for over a year. Paloma's breathing turned ragged. You can't prove that. I don't need to prove it. I'm not taking you to court. I'm just never going to help you. Goodbye, Paloma. I hung up. The final confrontation came on Dia de los Muertos. The Aguilar Hacienda hosted a massive celebration every year. The courtyards were filled with marigold petals and candlelit ofrendas, and the scent of pan de muerto drifted through every corridor. The family's allies and associates gathered in the grand salon, their faces painted like calaveras, their weapons concealed beneath embroidered jackets. I was standing beside Mateo near the main altar when I saw Paloma push through the crowd. She looked wrecked. Her dress was torn at the hem, her hair was tangled, and her face was gaunt with hunger and desperation. Behind her, two of Raul's creditors had followed her into the party, their expressions promising violence. "Marisol," she gasped, grabbing my arm. "They're going to kill me. Raul is gone and I have nothing, and the Fuentes people are going to dump my body in the desert unless you help me." I removed her hand from my arm. "You came to the wrong place, Paloma." She stared at me, her wild eyes darting between my face and Mateo's calm expression. "You don't understand. I'm your sister. We're twins. We came from the same womb. You can't just let him take me." "In another life," I said, "you pushed me off a cliff because you couldn't stand the fact that I was happy. In this life, you withheld Abuela's medication to force me into a marriage you thought would destroy me. You have spent every moment of both our existences trying to harm me."
You are not my sister. You are a stranger who shares my face. I nodded to one of Doña Valeria's security captains, who had been waiting near the back wall. The man stepped forward and clamped a hand on Paloma's shoulder. "The federal police have been tipped off about a pending homicide attempt against you," I said. "They're waiting outside the gate. They'll take you into protective custody tonight. The Fuentes organization will be rounded up within the week. I've spent the past 3 months feeding evidence to the Attorney General's office. You'll testify against Raul's creditors, and you'll spend a few years in a minimum security facility. But you will not die, Paloma. Death would be too merciful. I want you to live every single day knowing that I built an empire while you squandered everything." Paloma started screaming as the security captain dragged her out of the salon. Her cries echoed through the courtyard and faded into the night. Mateo put his arm around my waist. "The police are really here?" he said. "They are. We've been coordinating with the federal task force for half a year." Doña Valeria agreed. "The Fuentes cartel is old and reckless, and they've been drawing too much heat. Handing them to the authorities cleans up our territory and removes a threat. It's good business." Mateo pulled me closer and pressed a kiss to my temple. "You are terrifying in a way I find completely magnificent," he murmured. I leaned into him, and we walked out onto the terrace to watch the fireworks burst over the desert. The sky was clear and the stars were out, and I could identify every constellation that Mateo had taught me over the past 2 years. 5 years later, the Aguilar organization is no longer a cartel in the traditional sense. We've pivoted almost entirely into legitimate business: shipping, agriculture, real estate, and solar infrastructure across northern Mexico. The old dealers and enforcers have either retired or been absorbed into our security division, which now operates as a private contracting firm with government certifications. Doña Valeria passed peacefully 2 years ago, and Mateo and I now lead the family together. Paloma served 3 years in a federal women's prison in Chihuahua. After her release, she was given a small stipend and a bus ticket to anywhere she wanted. She chose to go south to a village in Oaxaca, where she works as a clerk in a municipal office and lives alone in a concrete block apartment. I receive updates on her occasionally through our network. She has never tried to contact me again. Abuela is 94 and still living in her mountain care facility. Her diabetes is under control and her memory is sharp enough that she still beats me at chess every Sunday. She knows now that I married into a family with a complicated history, but she has never asked for details. She just tells me she's proud that I learned how to stand on my own 2 feet and that I never let anyone push me around. Mateo and I still spend most evenings in the observatory. I've gotten good enough at the calculations that I can predict satellite transits and meteor shower peaks without his help.
He still corrects me occasionally, pointing out when I've misapplied a variable or assumed the wrong starting conditions, but he never makes me feel small. He just points at the error and says, try again. One night I asked him if he ever thinks about the other version of things. The version where I took the $5 million and ran. The version where Paloma married him and destroyed herself trying to be someone she wasn't. He thought about it for a long moment. I don't believe in parallel universes, he said finally. The math doesn't support it. I believe we get exactly one timeline and we either make it work or we don't. You made this one work, and you brought me into it with you. I leaned against his shoulder and looked up through the glass dome at the river of stars above us. I used to think my life was defined by what I escaped. An abusive upbringing, a violent neighborhood, a sister who wanted me dead. But now I know that my life is defined by what I chose to build. A family.
A future. A love that is rooted in honesty and never asks me to be anything other than exactly what I am. The girl who fell from a cliff in another lifetime is finally at rest. Not because she was avenged, but because she grew into a woman who no longer needed to fall. Paloma believed that life was a competition for limited resources. She believed that my success meant her failure. She believed that sharing a womb meant sharing a fate. She was wrong about all of it. Life is a telescope pointed at an infinite sky. You can spend your time squinting at the darkness, trying to see what someone else has, or you can adjust the focus and find your own constellation. I found mine, and I will spend the rest of my days mapping every star in it.